A police officer's funeral took an unexpected turn when his K9 partner jumped onto his casket. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Millfield. In this sleepy town, life moved at a measured pace, and its residents took pride in the safety and tranquility that came with living here. At the heart of this serenity stood two figures, beloved by the community, Officer James Carter and his loyal K9 partner, Shadow. Officer Carter was more than just a man in uniform, he represented the best of Millfield. His dedication to justice and his unwavering moral compass made him a symbol of integrity. Shadow, a sleek German shepherd with intelligent eyes, was always by his side. Together, they formed an unbreakable bond, a partnership built on trust and an unyielding commitment to serve and protect. But beneath the surface of this idyllic town, a darkness lurked. Captain Reynolds, a man known for his stern demeanor and iron-fisted control over the police department, ruled through intimidation. His cold eyes and calculated smile hid a sinister secret, one that threatened to shatter the very foundation of Millfield's peace. On a quiet evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, Officer Carter sat at his desk, poring over a stack of files. His brow furrowed as he read the contents, a sinking feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. The evidence before him pointed to a disturbing truth. Captain Reynolds was involved in a drug trafficking scheme, using his position to facilitate the flow of illegal substances into the town. Officer Carter knew he couldn't let this discovery go unaddressed. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, and to bring those who abused their power to justice. With a heavy heart, he gathered the incriminating documents and prepared to confront Captain Reynolds. Little did he know, as he stepped out of his office with Shadow by his side, that his fate had already been sealed. In the shadows, sinister forces were at work, ready to silence the truth before it could see the light of day. The next morning, Millfield awoke to a somber silence. News of Officer Carter's tragic death spread like wildfire, casting a pall over the once cheerful town. The official report stated that he had been killed in a car accident, his vehicle veering off the road and crashing into a tree. But whispers of doubt began to circulate, questioning the circumstances surrounding his untimely demise. Sarah Lawson, a dedicated journalist and longtime friend of Officer Carter, felt a wave of grief wash over her as she stood at the scene of the accident. The twisted metal and shattered glass spoke of a violent end, but something didn't feel right. Sarah had known James for years, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. As the town prepared for Officer Carter's funeral, an air of unease settled over the community. The police department, once a beacon of trust, now felt tainted by suspicion. Captain Reynolds, ever the stoic leader, assured the public that a thorough investigation would be conducted, but his words rang hollow to those who knew him well. On the day of the funeral, the town gathered to pay their respects to their fallen hero. The church was filled to capacity, with mourners spilling out onto the streets. Sarah sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the flag-draped casket that held her friend's body. Beside her, Detective Ruiz, Officer Carter's former partner, sat in solemn silence, his jaw clenched tight. As the service drew to a close, and the honor guard prepared to carry the casket to the hearse, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. Shadow, who had been lying quietly at the foot of the casket, suddenly leaped up and jumped onto the polished wood. The dog's mournful howls echoed through the church, a heartbreaking sound that spoke of a deep, irreplaceable loss. The attendees watched in stunned silence as Shadow refused to leave the casket, his body draped protectively over the flag. It was a moment that would be forever etched in the minds of those present, a poignant display of the unbreakable bond between a man and his loyal companion. In that instant, Sarah knew that Shadow's behavior was more than just an expression of grief. It was a message, a silent protest against the injustice that had claimed Officer Carter's life. And as she locked eyes with Detective Ruiz, a silent understanding passed between them. They would not let their friend's death be in vain. They would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. In the days following the funeral, Sarah threw herself into her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She pored over every detail of Officer Carter's life, searching for any clue that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding his death. As she dug deeper, she began to uncover a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the confines of Millfield. Detective Ruiz, driven by a sense of loyalty to his fallen partner, joined Sarah in her quest for the truth. Together, they followed leads and pieced together a picture of the dark underbelly that had taken hold of their town. At the center of it all stood Captain Reynolds, a man whose influence seemed to know no bounds. As Sarah and Detective Ruiz delved further into the investigation, they found themselves facing increasing resistance from within the police department. Officers who had once been friendly and cooperative now regarded them with suspicion and hostility. It became clear that the corruption ran deep, and those who dared to question it risked becoming targets themselves. But Sarah and Detective Ruiz refused to be intimidated. They knew that the only way to honor Officer Carter's memory was to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. And so, they pressed on, even as the danger around them grew. Throughout their investigation, Shadow remained a constant presence. The loyal dog, still mourning the loss of his partner, seemed to sense the importance of their mission. He would often sit at Sarah's feet as she worked late into the night, his watchful eyes scanning the room for any sign of threat. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Sarah stumbled upon a crucial piece of evidence. Hidden within a stack of old case files, she discovered a document that linked Captain Reynolds directly to the drug trafficking operation. With trembling hands, she brought the file to Detective Ruiz, knowing that they finally had the proof they needed to bring the corrupt captain to justice. But as they prepared to confront Captain Reynolds, they knew they were walking into a dangerous situation. The captain was a man with powerful allies and a ruthless streak, and he would stop at nothing to protect his empire of corruption. Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew they were risking everything, but they also knew that the truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Millfield, but the beauty of the day stood in stark contrast to the tension that crackled in the air. Sarah and Detective Ruiz, armed with the incriminating evidence against Captain Reynolds, made their way to the police station. They knew that confronting the captain on his own turf was a risky move, but they also knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. As they approached the station, Shadow, who had insisted on accompanying them, let out a low growl. The dog's hackles were raised, and his eyes were fixed on the building ahead. It was as if he could sense the danger that lurked within. Inside the station, Captain Reynolds sat at his desk, his face a mask of calm indifference. When Sarah and Detective Ruiz entered his office, he looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Lawson and Detective Ruiz," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady as she laid the incriminating document on the captain's desk. "We have evidence that links you to the drug trafficking operation in Millfield," she said, her eyes locked on Reynolds' face. "Officer Carter discovered your involvement, and we believe that his death was no accident." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Captain Reynolds let out a low chuckle. "You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into," he said, his voice taking on a menacing edge. "This goes far beyond Millfield, and you're meddling in affairs that you can't begin to understand." Detective Ruiz tensed, his hand hovering near his holster. "We understand enough," he said, his voice cold. "We know that you're a corrupt cop, and we're not going to let you get away with it." Captain Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said, his voice a low growl. "I have friends in high places, and they won't take kindly to your interference." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to back down. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We're going to expose the truth, no matter what it takes." Captain Reynolds rose from his chair, his face contorted with rage. "You've just signed your own death warrants," he snarled, reaching for his gun. In that moment, Shadow leaped into action. The loyal dog, sensing the danger to his human companions, lunged at the captain, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl. Reynolds stumbled back, his gun clattering to the floor as he tried to fend off the furious animal. Sarah and Detective Ruiz, seizing the moment, rushed forward to restrain the captain. As they struggled to subdue him, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived, summoned by a silent alarm triggered by the confrontation. As the officers flooded into the station, Sarah and Detective Ruiz emerged from the captain's office, subduing Reynolds in tow. The truth had been exposed, and the first step towards justice had been taken. But as they looked out over the sea of shocked and angry faces, they knew that their fight was far from over. The corruption that had taken root in Millfield ran deep, and it would take more than one arrest to purge it from the town. In the wake of Captain Reynolds' arrest, Millfield found itself in a state of upheaval. The revelation of corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement had shaken the community to its core. Trust in the police department had been shattered, and a sense of unease hung over the town like a dark cloud. Sarah and Detective Ruiz, hailed as heroes by some and reviled as troublemakers by others, found themselves at the center of the storm. They knew that their work was far from over, and that exposing the full extent of the corruption would be a daunting task. But they also knew that they had no choice but to press on, to see justice served and to honor the memory of their fallen friend. As they delved deeper into the investigation, they began to uncover a web of deceit that extended far beyond the borders of Millfield. They discovered evidence of a vast criminal network, with tentacles reaching into the highest echelons of power. Drug money flowed like water, greasing the palms of corrupt officials and fueling a system of graft and abuse. But even as they made progress, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves facing increasing resistance. Those who had benefited from the corruption were not willing to go down without a fight, and they used every tool at their disposal to thwart the investigation. Threats, intimidation, and outright violence became the order of the day, as the forces of darkness sought to maintain their grip on power. Through it all, Shadow remained a constant presence, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between a man and his loyal companion. The dog's unwavering devotion to the cause served as a reminder to Sarah and Detective Ruiz of the importance of their mission and of the sacrifices that had been made along the way. As the investigation wore on, the toll began to show on Sarah and Detective Ruiz. Late nights, endless paperwork, and the constant threat of danger took their toll, both physically and emotionally. But they refused to give up, knowing that the stakes were too high and the cost of failure too great. And so they pressed on, following the trail of corruption wherever it led, no matter the risk. They knew that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the soul of Millfield, and for the memory of all those who had been lost along the way. As Sarah and Detective Ruiz continued their investigation, they found themselves drawn into the heart of the criminal underworld. They infiltrated seedy bars and back-alley deals, posing as potential buyers and sellers in an effort to gather evidence and identify key players in the drug trade. It was during one of these undercover operations that they first crossed paths with Miguel Ortega, a young man with a troubled past and a fierce loyalty to his family. Miguel had grown up on the streets of Millfield and had seen firsthand the devastation that drugs could wreak on a community. When his younger brother had fallen victim to addiction, Miguel had vowed to do whatever it took to bring down those responsible. At first, Sarah and Detective Ruiz were wary of Miguel, unsure of his motivations and his allegiances. But as they spent more time with him, they began to see a different side of the young man. Beneath his tough exterior, Miguel had a heart of gold and a deep-seated desire to make a difference in his community. As the three of them worked together, they began to uncover a pattern of corruption that went beyond just the drug trade. They discovered evidence of money laundering, bribery, and even murder, all tied to a shadowy figure known only as the boss. But even as they made progress, the danger around them continued to grow. The criminal underworld was not about to let them dismantle their empire without a fight, and they soon found themselves the targets of increasingly violent attacks. Through it all, Shadow remained a constant presence, a silent guardian watching over them. The dog's keen senses and unwavering loyalty proved invaluable time and time again, as he alerted them to hidden dangers and helped them navigate the treacherous waters of the criminal underworld. As the investigation reached a critical juncture, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they were close to uncovering the truth. But they also knew that the closer they got, the greater the risk became. They were walking a tightrope, balancing the need for justice with the very real threat to their own lives. And so they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to see justice served. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had no choice but to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. As Sarah and Detective Ruiz delved deeper into the criminal underworld, they began to realize that the corruption they were fighting was not limited to Millfield alone. They uncovered evidence of a vast network of criminal activity, stretching across state lines and even international borders. At the center of it all was the boss, a shadowy figure who seemed to pull the strings from behind the scenes. Despite their best efforts, Sarah and Detective Ruiz were unable to uncover the true identity of this mastermind, who always seemed to be one step ahead of them. But even as they struggled to pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the boss, they began to make progress on other fronts. With the help of Miguel and a growing network of informants and allies, they began to chip away at the criminal empire piece by piece. They raided drug dens and money laundering operations, seizing millions of dollars in illicit funds and putting dozens of criminals behind bars. They worked tirelessly to build cases against corrupt officials and crooked businessmen, using every legal tool at their disposal to bring them to justice. But even as they made progress, the danger around them continued to escalate. The boss was not about to let them dismantle the empire without a fight, and soon Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves the targets of increasingly brazen attacks. They were followed by shadowy figures in the night, their homes and offices broken into and ransacked. They received threatening messages and mysterious packages, each one a chilling reminder of the power and reach of their unseen adversary. Through it all, they leaned on each other for support and strength. They knew that they were fighting a battle that was bigger than any one of them, and that the only way to win was to stand together. And so they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to see justice served. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had no choice but to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. As they looked to the future, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that the fight was far from over. But they also knew that they had the strength and the determination to see it through, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And with Shadow by their side, they knew that they would never be alone in their quest for justice. As the investigation continued, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves facing a new challenge, the growing unrest within the community of Millfield. The revelation of corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement had shaken the trust of many residents, who now viewed the police with suspicion and even hostility. Tensions ran high as protests and demonstrations broke out across the town, with angry citizens demanding accountability and change. Some called for the resignation of the entire police department, while others demanded a complete overhaul of the system. Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they had to tread carefully in this charged atmosphere. They understood the anger and frustration of the community, but they also knew that they needed to maintain order and stability if they were to continue their investigation. They worked tirelessly to build bridges with community leaders and activists, listening to their concerns and working to address them in a meaningful way. They held town hall meetings and forums, inviting residents to share their experiences and ideas for reform. As Sarah and Detective Ruiz worked to build trust with the community, they also continued to press forward with their investigation into the boss and the criminal network that had taken hold in Millfield. They knew that they were getting closer to the truth, but they also knew that the danger was growing with each passing day. They received a break in the case when one of their informants came forward with a crucial piece of information. The informant revealed that the boss was planning a major shipment of drugs into Millfield, and that the shipment was set to arrive in just a few days. Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they had to act fast. They assembled a team of trusted officers and set up a stakeout near the location where the shipment was set to arrive. They waited for hours, watching and listening for any sign of activity. Finally, as the sun began to set, they saw a van pull up to the location. Men in dark clothing began to unload large crates from the back of the van, working quickly and efficiently. Sarah and Detective Ruiz gave the signal, and their team moved in. They surrounded the van and the men, ordering them to drop their weapons and surrender. A fierce gunfight ensued, with bullets flying in all directions. In the chaos of the moment, Sarah saw one of the men reach for a gun. She reacted instinctively, firing her own weapon and dropping the man to the ground. As the smoke cleared, she realized that she had just taken a life in the line of duty. The weight of that realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. But she knew that she had no choice but to press on, to see the mission through to the end. As the team secured the scene and began to process the evidence, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they had struck a major blow against the boss and the criminal network. But they also knew that the fight was far from over, and that they would need to be more vigilant than ever in the days and weeks to come. In the aftermath of the raid on the drug shipment, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves facing a new set of challenges. The community of Millfield was still reeling from the revelation of corruption within the police department, and the news of the violent confrontation only added to the sense of unease and mistrust. Sarah in particular struggled with the weight of her actions. She had never taken a life before, and the realization that she had done so in the line of duty weighed heavily on her conscience. She found herself questioning her own judgment and wondering if there could have been another way. But even as she grappled with these difficult emotions, Sarah knew that she had to press on. The investigation was far from over, and she and Detective Ruiz still had work to do. They began to focus their efforts on tracing the money trail behind the drug shipment, hoping to uncover the identity of the boss and the full extent of the criminal network. They pored over financial records and interviewed witnesses, piecing together a complex web of transactions and shell companies. As they dug deeper, they began to realize that the corruption went far beyond just the police department. They uncovered evidence of politicians and business leaders who were in league with the boss, using their influence and power to protect the criminal enterprise. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering, and Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they were up against a formidable enemy. But they also knew that they had no choice but to see the investigation through to the end, no matter the cost. As they worked tirelessly to build their case, Sarah and Detective Ruiz drew strength from the support of the community around them. Despite the mistrust and unease that still lingered, they found that there were many in Millfield who believed in their cause and were willing to stand with them in the fight for justice. And so they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to see the truth brought to light. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had the strength and the determination to see it through to the end. As Sarah and Detective Ruiz continued to investigate the criminal network behind the boss, they began to realize that they were running out of time. They had uncovered evidence of a major deal that was set to take place in just a few days, a deal that would cement the boss's hold on power and make it nearly impossible to bring them to justice. They knew that they had to act fast, but they also knew that they needed more evidence to build a solid case. They reached out to their network of informants and allies, hoping to find someone who could give them the final piece of the puzzle. That's when they received a call from Miguel, the young man who had been working with them to infiltrate the criminal underworld. Miguel told them that he had overheard a conversation between two of the boss's top lieutenants, a conversation that revealed the location of a secret meeting that was set to take place the following night. Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that this was their chance. They assembled a team of trusted officers and set up a plan to infiltrate the meeting and gather the evidence they needed. They knew that it would be a dangerous mission, but they also knew that they had no choice but to take the risk. As night fell, they made their move. They stormed the location of the meeting, catching the criminals off guard and taking them into custody. In the chaos of the moment, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves face to face with one of the boss's top lieutenants, a man they had been chasing for months. The lieutenant was defiant at first, refusing to talk and threatening violence against the officers. But as the evidence against him mounted, he began to crack. He agreed to testify against the boss in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing the final piece of the puzzle that Sarah and Detective Ruiz needed to build their case. With the lieutenant's testimony and the evidence they had gathered, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they had the boss in their sights. They moved quickly to secure arrest warrants and coordinate with federal authorities, knowing that they had to strike fast before the boss could slip away. And so, in a dramatic raid that made headlines across the country, they took down the boss and the criminal network that had terrorized Millfield for so long. It was a moment of triumph and relief, a victory that had been hard-fought and long overdue. But even as they celebrated their success, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that their work was far from over. They knew that they had to continue to fight for justice and accountability, to work to rebuild the trust between the police and the community, and to create a better future for all the people of Millfield. In the days and weeks following the takedown of the boss and the criminal network, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters from across the country descended on Millfield, eager to tell the story of the small-town cops who had taken on a powerful criminal enterprise and won. At first, Sarah and Detective Ruiz were hesitant to step into the spotlight. They had never sought fame or attention, and they worried that the media attention would distract from the important work that still needed to be done. But as they listened to the stories of the people of Millfield, they began to realize the importance of their role as public figures. They heard from victims of the drug trade who had lost loved ones to addiction and violence, from small business owners who had been extorted and threatened by the criminal network, and from community leaders who had been fighting for years to bring about change. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah and Detective Ruiz stepped into the public eye. They gave interviews and speeches, using their platform to raise awareness about the issues facing Millfield and to advocate for the reforms that were needed to prevent something like this from happening again. They worked with community leaders and activists to develop new programs and initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust between the police and the people they served. They pushed for greater transparency and accountability within the department, and they fought to ensure that the officers who had been complicit in the corruption were held responsible for their actions. At the same time, they continued to work tirelessly to dismantle the remnants of the criminal network that had taken hold in Millfield. They knew that the fight was far from over, and that there were still many powerful individuals who were determined to protect their own interests at the expense of the community. But Sarah and Detective Ruiz were not alone in their fight. They had the support of a community that had been galvanized by their example, a community that was determined to take back their town and build a better future for themselves and their children. And so, with Shadow by their side, they pressed on. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had the strength and the determination to see it through to the end. And in the end, they knew that they would emerge from this crisis stronger, more united, and more committed to justice than ever before. As the dust settled in the wake of the takedown of the boss and the criminal network, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. They thought back to the early days of the investigation, when they had been driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to uncover the truth. They remembered the long nights and endless hours of work, the false leads and dead ends that had threatened to derail their efforts at every turn. They thought of the moments of doubt and despair, when the enormity of the task before them had seemed almost too much to bear. But through it all, they had persevered. They had drawn strength from each other and from the community around them, from the knowledge that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. And in the end, they had emerged victorious, having struck a blow against the forces of corruption and greed that had threatened to tear their town apart. As they looked to the future, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that there was still much work to be done. They knew that the fight for justice and accountability was far from over, and that they would need to remain vigilant in the face of new challenges and threats. But they also knew that they had the tools and the resources they needed to continue the fight. They had a community that was more engaged and empowered than ever before, a police department that was committed to serving and protecting the people of Millfield, and a sense of purpose that would guide them through whatever lay ahead. And so, as they stood together in the bright sunlight of a new day, Sarah and Detective Ruiz made a promise to each other and to the people of Millfield. They promised to never stop fighting for what was right, to never give up in the face of adversity, and to always stand up for the values of justice, integrity, and compassion that had brought them to this moment. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they had the strength and the determination to see it through to the end. And with Shadow by their side, they knew that they would never be alone in their quest for a better future. 10 years after the takedown of the boss and the criminal network that had once held Millfield in its grip, Sarah and Detective Ruiz found themselves back in the town where it had all begun. They had been invited to speak at a ceremony marking the anniversary of the investigation, a ceremony that would honor the sacrifices and the triumphs of all those who had played a role in bringing about change. As they looked out over the crowd of familiar faces, Sarah and Detective Ruiz were struck by how much had changed in the intervening years. The town of Millfield had been transformed, its streets now lined with thriving businesses and vibrant community centers, its people now filled with a sense of hope and possibility that had once seemed impossible. But even as they marveled at the progress that had been made, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that the fight for justice was far from over. They knew that there were still powerful forces at work in the world, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their own interests at the expense of the greater good. And so, as they took the stage to deliver their remarks, Sarah and Detective Ruiz issued a call to action. They called on the people of Millfield to remain vigilant in the face of new challenges and threats, to never lose sight of the values that had brought them to this moment, and to always stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. They spoke of the power of community, of the importance of coming together in times of crisis and working towards a common goal. They spoke of the need for accountability and transparency in all levels of government, and of the role that each and every individual could play in creating a better future for all. And as they looked out over the sea of faces before them, Sarah and Detective Ruiz knew that they had been a part of something truly special. They had helped to inspire a movement that had brought about real and lasting change, a movement that had shown the world what was possible when people of goodwill came together to fight for what was right. And so, with tears in their eyes and pride in their hearts, Sarah and Detective Ruiz stepped back from the podium, knowing that their work was far from finished, but also knowing that they had helped to lay the foundation for a better tomorrow. And as they walked off the stage, hand in hand, they knew that they would continue to fight for justice, for accountability, and for a world in which every person could live with dignity and hope. As they made their way through the crowd of well-wishers and supporters, Sarah and Detective Ruiz caught sight of a familiar face in the distance. It was Miguel, the young man who had played such a crucial role in the investigation all those years ago. He was older now, his face lined with the wisdom and experience of a life lived in service to others. As they embraced him, Sarah and Detective Ruiz felt a sense of gratitude and pride wash over them. They knew that they had been a part of something truly special, something that had touched the lives of countless people and helped to create a better world for all. And as they looked to the future, they knew that the fight for justice would continue. They knew that there would be new challenges and new threats to face, new obstacles to overcome and new victories to be won. But they also knew that they would face those challenges together, united in their commitment to the values that had brought them to this moment. And so, with Shadow by their side and the support of a community that had been transformed by their example, Sarah and Detective Ruiz stepped forward into the bright light of a new day, ready to continue the fight for a better tomorrow.